the next panel talk, so please take your seats and switch off your mobile phone. Welcome back, everyone. We will now begin our first panel session on regulatory framework for green finance and sustainability disclosure. Please welcome our moderators and panelists. For moderators, we will invite Professor Ma Jun, Professor of Practice, HKU Business School, Chairman and President for the Hong Kong Green Finance Association.
For the panelists, we have Mr. Michael DUIGNAN, Executive Director, Corporate Finance, Securities and Future Commission.
Mr. Sabino FORNIES-MARTINEZ, Minister Counsellor, Economics and Financial Affairs, Section, EU Delegation, Beijing.
Mr. Kenneth Ho, Executive Director, External, Hong Kong Monetary Authority.
Dr. Lun Bing, Member, International Sustainability Standards Board.
Let's take a group photo. Please look at the photographer at the front. Then please look at the photographer at the back of the theater. Thank you. Please take a seat.
Welcome back. It's my honor and pleasure to have the opportunity to moderate this panel discussion on regulatory framework for green finance and sustainability disclosure, which are actually two key words here, right? Regulatory framework, we have a lot of regulators and standard setting bodies, and now green finance certainly is objective. We want to generate flows of money into the area that we want to see, and making sure that during the flow we have the numbers to watch. These numbers will show us that they are indeed green, sustainable, low carbon, and protecting biodiversity. Now we have a group of very distinguished speakers today. Mr. Michael DUIGNAN. Am I pronouncing your last name okay? Yeah. Executive Director from the SFC. And Mr. Sabine FORNIES-MARTINEZ, Minister Counsellor, Economic and Financial Affairs of EU Delegation, Beijing. Thank you very much, Sabino, again, flying from Beijing to join and support our event here in Hong Kong. And Mr. Kenneth Hui, who is the Executive Director of HKMA. I believe Ken has been in charge of the taxonomy, right? The work, which is really a hot spot. Everybody is watching your work, and I'm sure you get a lot of questions today. And Mr. Bing Lung from ISSB, International Sustainability Standard Board. He's the only Chinese board member of the ISSB, which is a standard-setting body that's attracting, I think, most of attentions globally now on the landscape of regulations for sustainable finance flows. Now, let me just say a few words on what we call green finance framework. I guess not all of you are familiar with the concept. By framework, I mean we need to have at least 4 pillars to make sure that sustainable finance will flow in the large scale and to the right activities. Number 1, it's about the definition of green activities that green finance should support. Different countries choose different ways to define activities. In China, and I now think 70 jurisdictions, taxonomy is the approach. And that's why Hong Kong has adopted taxonomy recently. The 70 jurisdictions actually include Europe, right? You got 27 adopting one go with one taxonomy, but many others are taking their own approach of developing taxonomy. And the puzzle I'm trying to, tackle is that there are 300 taxonomies now in the world, and many of these are not by official sector, by private sector organizations, NGOs, industrial associations, banks, asset managers, and so on. And we're moving towards a pretty chaotic situation where too many taxonomies defining green activities in different way, and they're not consistent with each other. And how do we tackle that? And that's really a key issue that requires global coordination. And that's why in my time, when I was co-chairing the G20 Sustainable Finance Working Group, we spent a lot of time talking about that, and we came up with the conclusion that we need to improve the comparability, interoperability, and eventually consistency of alignment approach, including taxonomy. So that's one piece of work I think we want to discuss today. The second key pillar is disclosure. Taxonomy prevents greenwashing in some way, but it's not enough. If the data is fake, or you don't honor the data that you claim, then you will still end up with greenwashing. That's why a more robust and consistent, especially internationally consistent set of reporting standards can be needed. Without international consistency, we still see a lot of cross-border barriers. If each country has a different reporting standards, then FSC in all jurisdictions will be facing a big trouble. You won't be able to compare the sustainability indicator across different products coming from different markets. And also quality control transparency will become a problem. That's why ISSB is so important. It becomes the global baseline for sustainability standard, reporting standards. And again, this is endorsed by G20 because I knew this. I was involved in this discussion back 3 years ago about whether we should endorse it, and we did it. And that's how I think ISSB has this high profile to push the different regulators in different jurisdictions. And the third pillar is financial products. I won't spend too much time here. I think it's largely the job of private sector. We have a lot of private sector investment banks, asset managers here. They should do most of the job, but still they need to be guided on how to operate in the ecosystem, especially with regulations. And finally, incentive, which is the fourth pillar. That's very important, especially in areas where green activity is not profitable enough, but it still generated enough environmental benefits. So in all these areas, I hope we have a picture of a complete ecosystem for green sustainable finance. Before we dive into the specific discussion today, with a focus on Hong Kong and its international interoperability. Now, let me start actually according to my order instead of this order, which is arranged by our organizer from the university. Now, in my list, I start with Kenneth. Hong Kong been doing a lot on developing green finance service for the region, and in terms of amount of financing, I heard it's still the $80 billion, right? Raised in Hong Kong for green sustainable finance debt. And it's one of the biggest as the international, open financial markets. Can you just give us a little bit more update on what's the recent effort the Chinese authority, the Hong Kong authority regulators doing, what the private sector is doing in, enhancing its green finance market?
Thank you, Dr. Ma, for the questions, and it's a great pleasure to be able to come here and share with you some of the work that we've been doing. You're right, Dr. Ma. We have always been one of the leading international financial center in Asia, leveraging our strength in capital market. We've been building our green bond and most recently the green loan market, basically from the ground up. We now have roughly a third of the market share of the whole of Asia, by far the largest green finance market in Asia. In addition to green bond, which I think we all know basically started it all, we also see interesting development in green loans as well. And that's important because, as we all know, in Asia, bank is still a very important source of financing. So the fact that banks' loans is making up an increasingly large proportion. In 2022, I think it actually overtook green bonds as a most important source of green financing. In 2023, it fell a little bit, but it's still important, kind of broadly comparable to green bonds. The fact that it's becoming more mainstream also shows that green finance is taking basically a center role in a lot of the companies' financing decision. we are also seeing a broadening of the use of proceeds from these green loan, green bond. Previously, it was mainly green building, and now we're seeing, for example, waste management, transportation, energy, etc., etc. So a much more kind of broad-based and balanced use of proceeds, which also means that the green finance space is kind of broadening, becoming more balanced as well. As to what we've been doing, I think what you said just now, Dr. Ma, incentive is a key thing that we've been trying to provide to our financial industry as well as the corporate sector. Some of the green project, or more generally, kind of getting into green finance, we realize is still something that some corporates, particularly those that are slightly smaller, may have hesitation. After all, creating green framework, looking for external reviewer, actually understanding your own firm's transition pathway is something that takes time and resources. So this is one area that we've been trying to address, and the government as well, with real money. Basically, we are now we've been doing that for the past 3 years now, but we've been subsidizing corporates as well as non-corporate issuers that want to do bonds or loans in Hong Kong. We've been paying them up to 2.5 million Hong Kong dollar if they do that for the first time. We're also subsidizing their choice of reviewer. So
this is a grant scheme, right?
This is the grant scheme, yeah. Exactly, to provide them with incentive to go green. So that's one important area that we've been doing. Awareness is another area that we feel many, particularly Asia investors, Asia corporates, as well as the general public, do not always have the strongest kind of green environmental awareness. This is something that the government and the HKMA have been trying to push. The government, the most obvious example is the launch of its own green bond program, not just at the institutional level, but for 2 times issuing retail tranches. The idea is really, through participation, through investing, to allow the general public to get a better understanding of what's going on in Hong Kong in terms of green, in terms of sustainability adaptation. The HKMA as well, in addition to bond, we are also pushing for our own environmental standard for its incorporation in our investment portfolio as well. Just to give an example, in terms of the carbon emission, carbon density of our own equity portfolio, it dropped by 47% over the past 5 years. So it's quite a substantial fall, and we hope that by doing it ourselves, we really would be kind of encouraging the industry to take up more.
Thank you, Kenneth. As I said, the industry is focused on taxonomy because you spent a few years really came up with this milestone piece of regulation, which is a definition of official definition of green activities, green financial support in Hong Kong. And I see lots of tables in the taxonomy which talks about interoperability with common ground taxonomy, with EU taxonomy, with others, and a lot of application scenarios for building, transportation, energy, and so on. How do you think the industry should use it? Are there going to be lots of specific guidelines, operational details that's coming out to help with the usage of the taxonomy?
Yeah, taxonomy is something that we've been working quite hard over quite a few years. I only just came across the 300 plus taxonomy in the world figure. And if you take a step back and
2 years ago, I said 200, and recently I had my people count it again. They said 300.
Yeah, I mean, I think everybody kind of see the importance of having a proper definition, but the proliferation of taxonomy, I think, is not really helping, to be honest. And the interoperability issue as well. So we built on the common ground taxonomy. Thanks again to your great work, Dr. Ma. We built on the common ground taxonomy, which basically set out the similarity between the EU and the China taxonomy. One is the leading, generally recognized as the highest international green standard. The other one is one of the most committed and one of the most important carbon emitter in the world. Right on that common ground taxonomy and develop Hong Kong's own. Operationalizing it turned out to be not straightforward. That's part of the reason why it's taken us longer than expected. Finally, we're there. Now we have 4 key sectors. that are the most relevant to Hong Kong, building, transportation, waste management, and all that. And we hope that by launching it, giving the industry a feel of how it's like, we would slowly encourage more adaptation. Right now is voluntary, so capital market activity, banking activity, they can choose to adopt it. We believe it provides a good reference point for investors as well as issuers to basically have a clear definition of what is and is not green. Over time, we would look to consider whether to make it mandatory, at least in the banking sector, so that we have a solid investor base. And we are also looking to broaden it to not just the 4 most important areas, but in new area, hydrogen, for example, hydropower, for example, and also into transition activities as well.
I'd like to say a few words on how I think it should be used. Based on my experience of doing this in China, I was leading the drafting of the Chinese first taxonomy. And then we sort of implement it in a couple of ways. The 3 ways you can do implementation. One is labeled financial products. You label green loans, label green bonds against taxonomy. That's easy. The second one is ask the banks to report the amount of green loans and green bonds against taxonomy to you and to the general public. The disclosure of such number itself becomes the incentive. Right? If you disclose a bad number, it looks very bad. Disclose a good number, everybody is encouraged. Your customers will like it, and your founders will like it, your depositors will like it, and you have a good business. And the third thing is to use the taxonomy to allocate incentives. And if you have any goodies from the regulator, whether you give them cheap money, give them grants, and give them a chance to go to a good meeting, give them an opportunity to meet my boss, based on the performance of the green activities, which again is based on the taxonomy. These are 3, I think, very easy usage I think we can go for. But I still think the adoption is more complicated than this. For example, I was in the meeting with the building guys yesterday, and they are talking about how to measure the green building as green. Carbon emission, the energy intensity, who holds the database, who provides the assessment tools. There are too many tools, too many databases. Nobody is official. Then it creates a lot of chaos. Maybe you should coordinate. Kenneth should tell them, this is the one to use and that is the one to use to make the cost much manageable than otherwise. But anyway, I'll leave the question for Kenneth for now and switch to Michael on disclosure. As I said, ISSB is a hot topic today, and we have Mr. Lam Bing from ISSB, setting body here as well. I think Hong Kong is one of the few jurisdictions that took the lead in announcing a adoption plan, and with specific dates and timetable and all that. I really appreciate that. I think you have a timetable, then the company began to act. Without timetable, they keep delaying. They never know whether a stick is going to hit you. And that's why I think it's a very good example that Hong Kong has set for many other jurisdictions. But of course, I'm sure there are a lot of challenge. When you do consultation with companies, they complain, I don't know how to do this, I don't know how to do that, it's too costly, I don't have manpower, my boss doesn't support me. What are the key challenges you feel as a regulator that you need to help the companies, listed companies, overcome in the coming few years to perform with a good quality against ISSB?
Okay, first of all, thank you very much for inviting me. I don't really need to say any more because you actually answered, I think, your own question. Those are all the challenges. And apparently, the disclosure by listed companies doesn't actually matter very much, according to Ronnie, because it's the whole idea is that this was information for investors, and investors aren't actually moving the needle very much. So I think we're done here. No, the objective primarily was to be a leading jurisdiction. Yes, we suffered a little bit from first mover disadvantage, but we've kind of brought it back to what I think is something reasonably based on ISSB standards. And so therefore, although people focus on the differences, I think as long as all of these standards are essentially based on ISSB standards, then we're in pretty good shape and a lot better shape than we would have been otherwise. The big problems are that some companies have literally no idea what they're supposed to do. And so therefore, one of the most important things, although the exchange, we worked a lot with the exchange, and the exchange produced the disclosure standards, the climate disclosure standards. They were published in April. But although the rules are there, actually the really important document, in my view, was the guidance that associated it. It was considerably larger than the rules, but that was an attempt at trying to help companies get to the point where they can actually disclose meaningful information. Because I think that one of the big problems here is that a lot of companies are going to treat it as a compliance exercise. They are going to produce the bare minimum requirements in terms of disclosure in order to just put a tick in the box and say, yeah, we've done that, and worry less about what people actually do with that information. Because for them, it is just cost. It's one of those asymmetric things. For them, it's just cost at the moment, because they have to be shown that there is a real linkage between what the information they provide and what investors then do with that information and how that affects companies. The SEC have made it very, very clear that this is disclosure for investors. Whether the investor behavior then follows through to a change in corporate behavior is not the role of the regulators. In a sense, this is pure information at this point. I think the world is probably better off as a result of receiving this information, so it is still worth doing. Even if investors don't move the dial, I think the world is still better off for knowing this because it forces companies to address these issues themselves. As far as ISSB was concerned, one of the biggest problems for Hong Kong, or the Hong Kong market, I suppose, our rules apply to, the exchange's rules, the listing rules apply to essentially a market that is about 7% Hong Kong incorporated companies that are actually here. The vast majority of companies listed in Hong Kong are not incorporated here. They are essentially PLC businesses. And so therefore, one of the biggest challenges for us was to introduce rules that straddled that, because China as a whole is at a different place in its development as compared to Hong Kong as a jurisdiction. So trying to create a sort of bridge between those two meant that we had to base the standards on ISSB, but we had some flexibility associated with that. We had to introduce all of the flexibilities built into ISSB and not just cut and paste. This is very much an interim step. The intention is, much like IFRS, at a future point, the detailed listing rules will be reduced down to a single line that says companies have to disclose what HKI CPAs say they have to disclose. And that's basically what it's going to come down to. So for those who are interested in what HKI CPA is doing in terms of their fact-finding, things like that, feel free to write them a postcard on setting out your thoughts, because they're the ones who are going to be doing it going forward. As it currently stands for big companies, they are going to have to comply rather than comply or explain with effect from 2026. They are the ones for whom it is, they have the biggest impact, but there's the biggest impact on themselves, as it were. So they cover both ends. So that's the challenges were the things that you've already mentioned. Actually, the measurement is actually one of the biggest things. Personally, I think assurance is the sort of the underdeveloped part of all of this. It's all very well for people to produce stats, but if those stats don't actually mean anything because they're not based on anything real, then that's a real problem. And so assurance is, as I said, underdeveloped in my view. That is coming later. But what we're trying to do in terms of climate disclosure, if you compare it to accounting standards, accounting standards took, 30 years to go from something to something that was internationally accepted and recognized and had good assurance standards. And we're trying to do that with climate in about 3 years instead. So for me, that's a real problem and a real risk. Ironically, actually, I think it is actually the Europeans that are, to some extent, going to force the rest of the world. The Europeans learnt about extraterritoriality from the Americans, of course, but they've learned very well, and they're doing it even better. Anybody who supplies a European company is going to have to provide them with information. And if they don't provide information, then the EU company is going to use another supplier. So my guess is there are going to be some PRC suppliers who are more than happy to provide some figures. The question is whether or not those figures are actually real and actually reflect the reality. And I think that's going to be a real challenge going forward.
Thank you, Michael. You mentioned mainland Chinese companies. I have a question regarding a mainland Chinese company listed in Hong Kong with operation in Hong Kong and operation in mainland. Is this company required to report ISSB for all its mainland-based businesses, or only required to report based on ISSB for its Hong Kong-based businesses?
We wouldn't differentiate. Essentially, it is required to provide meet the climate disclosure requirements set out in the rules in relation to its operations, full stop. So across the board. That becomes an interesting challenge for A&H issuers because they are listed in Hong Kong. They'll have to do it for their entire business in relation to Hong Kong listing rule standards. But obviously the PRC exchanges have their own standards, and therefore they'll have to do it in relation to those standards. The objective would be to produce one report that effectively covers both. There are some differences, but the differences are relatively minor, so they should be able to do that. And I think that's probably where we're going to end up. As I said, I think people, rather than focusing, I appreciate the fact that it's 300 taxonomies and all of that. The question in my mind would immediately be, are the big differences in terms of those taxonomies? Are we in a better place overall, despite those small differences?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that leads to the question of interoperability for disclosure standards, right? Which means that if a multinational company operating in 60 different countries, 60 countries have 60 different ISSB-based disclosure requirement because it's ISSB plus something, right? It's not identical. And this is a question maybe I'll be asking Mr. Leng later on. Well, of course, it applies to Europe as well. You've got a lot of multinational operating elsewhere. But again, for Michael, do you think the adoption of ISSB by Hong Kong through the Hong Kong-listed Chinese companies is going to be doing some very good capacity building for the rest of the Chinese companies in mainland China?
It certainly can't help. I mean, I think capacity building overall is a real problem. It's a real practical problem. So to some extent, I think the educational courses that were referred to earlier on are great because you are guaranteed a job, absolutely guaranteed a job if you qualify on one of those courses. Because at the moment, everybody is poaching from everybody else as far as anybody who knows anything at all about climate sustainability and all those other things, partly because nobody can define what climate sustainability and all those other things actually mean. But everybody is more than happy to pay for somebody else who says they know about it, because most people know very, very little. So that capacity building is a real problem. You end up having to try and do sort of shortcuts. I was going to mention it later on, but one of the things that we did as an organization, we worked with a university in Hong Kong, essentially to develop a very, very I don't want to say quick and dirty or unsophisticated, but a targeted tool such that small companies could punch in their numbers, basically their electricity bill, and that would produce a very good piece of data in relation to what their emissions actually were, so that they could report on that without having to do all of the work themselves. Now, that was a very, very simple way of creating sort of capacity building, if you like, because they can then report that to others. You can. It definitely produces a number. Don't ask me whether or not that's a more accurate number. I am simply not qualified to do that.
Well, it actually increased quality by reducing errors on technical calculation, because the system can put in all these emission factors. You only need to put in, for example, the type of fossil fuel you use and how many tons it's going to calculate carbon emission for you, instead of you do this manually. So in that sense, I think it enhances the quality and reduce cost. Now, let me move to Sabino on the European situation, especially on disclosure. As we all know, Europe has already adopted the ESRS disclosure standard, which is based on double materiality, not so much like ISSB that focus on investor value. And I do hear recently some discussions popping up on, your disclosure standard is different from other places which adopts, the sort of very basic model of ISSB. And if a company operates in many different jurisdictions, they need to report it based on the local reporting standards. Would it create some interoperability problem? How do you address that problem going forward?
Thank you, and also again, thank you for inviting me. I mean, I think that's an important problem. I mean, I was also listening at the other speakers, and I see also that we are sharing a lot of common issues. For example, when we were talking about implementation, this is one issue that for the Europeans is key, because we have been adopting a lot of legislation, a very big framework that goes from taxonomies to green bonds to ratings. I mean, we have overall a comprehensive green framework, but now the issue is implementing and trying to break the resistance from those that have to implement it in order to implement it correctly. Because, I mean, we are facing the same problems. All the companies complaining about a lot of red tape. This is a compliance cost. So, I mean, what I wanted to say is that at the end, I mean, from our experience, it's mostly, I mean, it's not only that the regulators have to impose, but there must be social awareness, and there must be social demand for green transition and from green finance. And this will, of course, only come when the people will be more and more aware of the impact of the climate and environmental issues in their daily lives. As you mentioned at the beginning, this thing in your Deutsche Bank conference, I think that when the people will see that, they will be forcing the companies to do all these issues that at the end they will see that this is in their own benefit. And then going into the issue of the reporting, it is true that we in Europe, we have adopted a somehow different reporting standards than the ISSB is somehow, because I would say that they are based on the ISSB. There is not that we have a completely different reporting system, but we have included some elements in terms of scope and in terms of double materiality, again, because our policy objective was not only for the companies to see how climate and environmental related issues were impacting their accounts, but also how the activities of the companies were material to the objective of fighting climate change. So, I mean, at the end, it is a little bit more comprehensive from the point of view of how it relates to the ISSB, and if it creates problems. I would say that for European companies, I mean, it's not a big deal, because in fact we are basically imposing on them the same as what the ISSB has, plus. So, I mean, if you go to another jurisdiction and you are obliged to change, to disclose on the basis of the ISSB or on the basis of the other jurisdiction, probably you have already complied. It might be necessary that you need to adapt the way in you are reporting. It is true that if you are a foreign company that comes into the EU, that could be a further burden to comply with that. But it's true that, I mean, in terms of application, we are not imposing these standards into foreign companies unless they are active in in the EU. Of course, this issue of the suppliers is a matter of concern, and when we are applying our standards to foreign companies, because they have a significant presence in the EU, it's more than 150 million of operations, or they are listed in a European stock exchange, but this is not so material as in Hong Kong, because we are not international financial center. It's very interesting. After the Brexit, most of the companies that are listed in European stock exchanges are European. So it's only for those with operations of more than 150 million, and there we are also trying to adopt some legislation that could define how they will have to report on the basis of the ESG. So, I mean, we acknowledge there is an issue. We don't think that there is a major issue for European companies. We also don't think that there is a major issue for foreign non-European companies, but of course, in any case, we are trying to come out with solutions, and I mean, we are always favorable to having as more common international standards as possible. Thank you.
Now, when you say it's not a big deal in terms of interoperability, are you really talking about something like what I had in mind? You do the ISSB-based disclosure report, then you add another chapter, which is about the materiality, material impact on environment, on society. And this become optional in jurisdiction like Hong Kong, but it's mandatory in your jurisdiction. So just this add-on, right? Additional information doesn't necessarily have to redo the entire report, right? Is that?
Yeah, that should be the idea. I mean, something that it is practical. This is why we are working with experts in order to define how this compatibility can be achieved. And we, in the next legislative period, which is from year 2025, we will be adopting something in this sense. Thank you.
Yeah, it's interesting to know that mainland China, the Ministry of Finance just came up with a consultation version, or the ISSB-based disclosure rule for consultation back just a month ago, right? And they adopted double materiality, which is interesting in the sense that I think both Europe and China are so-called quote-unquote socialist, with some socialist mindset and with a stronger focus on social impact, rather than focusing only on the impact for investors. In that sense, there's interoperability between mainland China and Europe already. But now, let me now drive this question to Mr. Leng Bing. From your eyes of ISSB, what is the landscape of adoption? You now have X number of country jurisdictions saying they will adopt, or looks like they're adopting, and how many are lined up, and how many are doing nothing?
Thank you, Dr. Ma. Thank you so much for this question, because it's a little sensitive for me, for ISSB board members sitting on the same panel discussion with people from FSTB, from certain authorities in Hong Kong, from SFC, the securities regulator in Hong Kong, and delegates from European EU. But I'm managing to share adequately with all of our attendees on this question. The short answer is the outcome so far is quite positive, maybe much more positive than we imagined a couple of weeks ago. Because at the end of May, as you flagged just now, at the annual meeting of ISSB, we published the inaugural jurisdiction guide and jurisdiction guide for adoption of ISSB standards or other use of ISSB standards. And at the same time, we announced there is we can call that an inaugural cohort or inaugural group of supporters. They have announced their plan, their roadmap towards adoption of ISSB standards or their jurisdictional standards based on ISSB standards or functionally equivalent, functionally aligned with ISSB standards. I'm quite sure all of the jurisdictions sitting here on this flight are in that list. There are more than 20, a little more than 20 jurisdictions in that list. Accounts,
including Europe, right, which is 27 something, right?
Of course, because I need to remind everybody, in accordance with CSRD, the mandate of IFRAG, the setter of ESRS, includes to embedded the global baseline, that's us, global baseline into the ESRS. That's their mandate, and it's quite successful, except some minor concern maybe. For example, the issues in so-called column A should not be there. The mandatory requirements on to disclose your finance emission. Yeah, that's not mandatory, totally mandatory in ESRS. But anyway, that's not a major concern about that. And for this, let's back to the inaugural cohort of supporters to advocacy standards. They account for a little more than 40% of global GDP, around 55 of global market capitalization. If we exclude United States capital market, this percentage is up to 75. So that's what I mean is much more positive than we expected. Also, as you flagged, the Ministry of Finance issued their roadmap, their strategy towards using our standards almost as a last second and changed the portions I mentioned just now. But anyway, they have been there. And each jurisdiction, they have their own way, considering they have their own story, considering their own circumstances, taking their own pathway towards to use our standards. That's all. We respect that. But anyway, each of them, they have announced their plan to start their travel to use ISSB standards as a truly global baseline to enhance the comparability and assurability, as you said, Michael. And I would add another one. The third point is enforceability. That's for you. Enforceability, sustainability-related information globally. That's amazing. Because in this process, a potential risk actually we need to alert everybody is from voluntarily fragmented to mandatorily fragmented. That's a disaster to investors and to regulators. Because I'd echo you, Michael, actually, that's not only a challenge of capacity building to preparers, to practitioners, but also to regulators. That's a very big challenge. You need more time to start your travel. And about the double materiality, I think that's a very sensitive argument, because from one perspective, from one side, I guess my former colleagues from Ministry of Finance China, they would like to share more common interests and features with colleagues from Europe, from European Commission, from EC, from EU. But at the same time, I think they managed to avoid the argument about double materiality or single materiality. Because from the perspective of ESRS, they created a term called double materiality. I would say that is focused on investors and at the same time to satisfy the information need of other stakeholders. That's more acceptable, generally acceptable to many experts. And I think that's what Ministry of Finance of China, MOF China, they are doing. That's definitely will be a part of our approach to apply this truly global baseline. We call that building block approach. We are playing a role of global baseline to satisfy the information need, focus on investors, and building block to satisfy information need for broader scope of stakeholders, like GRI reporting, focus on all stakeholders, almost all stakeholders, including investors, can be added as a building block. And any industry-specific requirements can be added as a building block. That's what we call that. So I think that's a...
Thank you, Mr. Lembing. I think In 3 areas, I heard a lot of complaint from company for not being able to in complying with your ISSB quickly. One is the scope 3, they don't know how to do. Secondly, climate stress testing, and thirdly, transition plan towards net zero. How are you going to help them? What kind of capacity building efforts are ISSB thinking about?
Thank you so much, sir. Actually, this question, the answer to this question is supposed to be more comprehensive, rather than not only answer very briefly, capacity building, or give you more time or more temporary relief. No, I don't think that's a real answer to that. A couple of points I need to flag here. The first point is why we need a site of truly global baseline as designed for mandatory use rather than voluntary initiatives, because people need money. We have the head of FTB in Hong Kong here. In Mandarin, we call that 财神爷. But anyway, I don't think you have adequate funds to support the transition of Hong Kong. No, because the only hope for us, the only opportunity for us to succeed in the campaign we call that decarbonization is to establish a well-functioning lever to lever a huge amount of funds from private sectors to use the money from investors. If you want that money, tell them your story, not as you will, but in accordance with a set of general accepted global baseline. That's what we are doing. That's the view of us in this large ecosystem. We are relatively small, but we stand at the front or outpost called disclosure standards for mandatory use. This is the first point. The second point is to call that a truly global baseline to support a robust funding mechanism to support the decarbonization or sustainable development. There are a couple of very integrated part or essential elements should be included in your corporate reporting system. Scope 3 is one of them. Scope 3 is, in my personal understanding, I don't think Scope 3 is within the scope to discuss, to negotiate whether we can have that. The only answer is how to introduce that. My recommendation will be a phasing approach to require the topics, the largest listed companies to do that. And we'll never push that in SMEs, just within the scope of public accountability companies, public companies. Because Scope 3 is not only a reporting burden or responsibility of reporting or compliance of large companies, because at the same time, that's a process to collect information and report that as a part of the Scope 3. For example, finance emission of commercial bank or large co-reporting entity in the value chain. And at the same time, there's also a process for the large companies to provide money to support more ambitious efforts by the smaller companies and SMEs in its value chain towards decarbonization jointly with the large companies, because a better value provided by investors based on their information of sustainability reporting and the better value they have more money to push to the suppliers and other stakeholders in their value chain. That's the point of Scope 3. That's the nature, substance of why we need Scope 3. And actually, there's another concern, like you said, industry-specific requirements. I noted it's tricky when we talk about this issue, particularly considering the finalized rules code of Hong Kong Stock Exchange. There's no explicit requirement on that. I would say why we need that, because investors need that. If you want money from investors' pocket, you need to provide information about that, because to keep it comparable. That's very, very important. And also climate resilience or scenario analysis. We provide quite a lot of relief to help people to introduce themselves into this. And also, we refuse to define what scenario analysis is. So you can use almost all narrative in the very beginning of your travel to report that. And you increase the usage of your quantitative information and maybe some models in that in the next stage. So that's for.
So I think Mr. Lembing essentially said, don't worry, all the difficult issues, if you don't know, we are going to help you, either by giving a relief or giving a grace period. I'll help you with some tools or help you with a free training course or something. So that's a very good answer. Now, let's move on to the Q&A session. I think we have like 10 minutes. I'd really love to see some questions from the audience. Yeah, Chao-Ni?
Thank you very much, Dr. Ma and the panelists for the discussion. I have two questions, one's to Ken and one's to Mark. Ken, you mentioned that Hong Kong captures 1/3 of the sustainable financing in Asia, which is very significant. And so with the taxonomy, how can HKMA accelerate the broadening of the taxonomy to include more green and transition activities so that the capital market can continue to mobilize capital to support these urgent decarbonization? And the second question is to Mark. You actually emphasized a few times that investors are not moving the dial. So what are the carrots and sticks that SFC can introduce to further push the integration of ESG investing in Hong Kong? Thank you.
Michael, right?
Sorry, Michael, sorry.
Maybe I'll have a go first. Indeed, broadening the coverage of taxonomy is one of the kind of key tasks that we're working on. Partly is to broaden it to other green activities beyond the 4 key areas that I mentioned just now. You know, hydrogen, hydropower are things that we have in mind right now. The other kind of broadening is to do that in transition activities. But what we realize from preparing our first iteration of the Hong Kong taxonomy is that operationalizing the common ground taxonomy into the Hong Kong version, into the local version is difficult. Partly because a lot of the idiosyncrasy of the EU and also China is not so easily adapted to Hong Kong, but we also have to take into account the fact that, you know, Hong Kong has its own kind of specific standards, circumstances, industry classification, for example, building standard, for example. So while we're going to work very hard on that, we're also thinking about what stopgap measures we can kind of roll out for now. One thing that we have in mind is that in respect of transition activities, whether there are things we can do, something like a toolkit or, you know, some kind of guidance that we can provide to the industry that, you know, basically on one hand help them to get on this transition bandwagon. On the other hand, also provide them some cover against potential accusation of transition greenwashing. One thing we are also doing is to integrate transition and also common ground taxonomy, in fact, into the incentive scheme, the grant scheme that we've been providing to corporates, so that, you know, short of any mandatory requirement, at least they have the financial incentive to start using it.
Thank you. Michael?
It's not the securities regulator's role to push investors one way or the other. What our role, though, is to make sure that they're not being misled in any way. So it would kick in relation to the point that's been mentioned earlier on, greenwashing. So if you say that you are investing only in green products, etc., then you have to actually be able to demonstrate that. So we have introduced codes in relation to asset managers. If they say that they are investing in green products, etc., they have to be able to back that up. I take a slightly contrarian view. I actually regard the fact that we've had to do that is actually a moderately positive thing, because that means that people see some advantage in claiming that they're green when they're not. I suspect 20 years ago, it wouldn't have mattered if they'd claimed that they were green. People weren't paying any attention. So at least now people are paying attention. That doesn't mean I'm not advocating people cheating, but if they do cheat, then we will go after them. So we're setting in place those sort of codes. We worked recently actually with a private sector organization called ICMA, International Capital Market Association, to create a code for ESG ratings to again create some sort of reliability in relation to ratings, because well, I would rate them on between a 1 and a 9 and probably about a 3. But that doesn't mean anything. You have to understand what that actually means. It has to be meaningful. So that's where our role comes in order to make sure that people are investing, in a sense, in a knowledgeable way. That doesn't mean to say that if they want to invest in American coal mines, we're not going to stop them. That's their choice.
Great. Let's get one more question from the very back.
Thank you very much. It's very good to be here, to be back to HKU as alumni. So in my daily work, so I work at S&P Global, and my team really looks at a lot on the climate analytics, and so we really put a lot of focus on regulatory reporting and sustainability disclosure. In my daily job, I think the questions that I got from my clients, they always, from my corporate clients, always ask me about how do I, we talk a bit today about the quantification and quantifying climate scenarios, scope 3 and all that, but how does that really impact the user, which is the capital markets and investors, right? Are my investors, are those financial institutions really look at my financial statements and take that into account? So I guess my question really is, how do we incentivize the integration about the sustainability quantified information into the financial statements, and then really let the markets start to use them and start to price in those kind of factors. And also because I think we talk a little bit about interoperability and the different standards. The Midland Stock Exchange have less stringent requirements on scope 3, on climate scenarios, whereas Hong Kong EX has more stringent ones. So we have these different steps, right? So how, on the investor side, how do they really operate and take these differences into account when they really count these different kind of information reporting? Thanks.
Sounds like a big question, integrating sustainability into financial reporting, which is disagreed by ISSB, right? And you guys have different views. So whoever wants to...
I can take that firstly and hand it over to Michael, okay? From my perspective, actually, that's not integrate the sustainability-related information into financial statements, because there are two stories. Try to review the same events and transaction by the same reporting entity, but they are different. They are different, but connected very closely. That's what we call the connection between the sustainability disclosure and the financial statements. And also I'd pick up a couple questions, points from you. It's really hard for me to answer each specific question from the perspective of investors. I'll pick up a couple of them. The first one is, for example, the industry-specific requirements as required in S1 and S2. I'd use an example just discussed here very well. Greenwashing. Industry-specific requirements will make greenwashing, most of greenwashing, have nowhere to hide before the investors. And another is climate resilience, or as you said, scenario analysis. Scenario analysis, actually, it's a very, we refuse to define that, and actually you can use a very, very broad scope of approach called scenario analysis in accordance with the requirement of IFRS 2. Considering your own, commensurate with your own circumstances, considering your own skills, capabilities, and resources. So including the data availability and the data quality. So I think very good questions. It's not only a question to investors, but also to practitioners, to comparers and regulators. We'd like to travel with every jurisdiction to explore, to detect the concerns in practice and try to solve that together with all of our stakeholders. For example, we established the transition implementation group, TAKE. We call that TAKE. We meet in person. We meet in person every 3 weeks, and then we got globally representative from practice to figure out the challenges. I extremely encourage Hong Kong stakeholders and via Hong Kong to submit your concerns and issues in practice? Thank you.
Very, very quickly. I would say, don't forget that we're on a journey. We're starting from a situation where there were 400 plus standards, according to, that was when the Bloomberg report first came out, there were 400 plus standards. So I would say we are still early stages in that journey in terms of getting ever better, ever more meaningful, ever more accurate disclosure. Companies are going to struggle realistically from at the start in the early stages. But essentially, I think most people are learning by doing, so they will get better. There will be some impact from investors reacting to good disclosure from some companies that will force other companies to up their game by comparison. But it's not like accounting standards, which in theory should be much more predictable and much easier to get at. As I said, I use accounting standards as an sort of alternative example, but it took years and years to get those to a point where at least everybody agreed that they were roughly okay and could be used by many companies around the world. So I think we're still at early stages yet. That's not to say that we shouldn't try and improve and get better as we go on. I think that will happen automatically. So I think to some extent any investor who turns around and says, I need to be able to compare the information from this company as compared to that company, and I need to be able to do that now, is probably being unrealistic. They're still in a better place than they would have been last year, quite frankly. And it will only improve.
Thank you. Professor He, can we get another 15 minutes? Looks like many hands. Is that okay?
Maybe one more question. We don't have more.
Only one more? Then probably no more, because I have a question. Because I wanted to ask Sabino, and I was hoping you guys could ask, but Sabino, we have talked a lot about CGT, Common Ground Taxonomy, and it's a collaboration between China, Europe. I was co-chairing from the China side. Your colleague, myself, have co-chair from the European side. I think it's now being used as a reference for many other taxonomies and used for cross-border green capital flows. What's your outlook of CGT? Can it enhance its ability to improve interoperability?
Yeah, thank you. I will try to be brief. I'm mindful of time. Besides the Common Ground Taxonomy, of course, our collaboration with China is very important. So, and I would like to highlight this here in front of everybody. We are very much committed to collaborating with China in this issue of climate change and every other issue on finance. We have created a specific working group that is up and running between the European Commission and China to discuss many different issues on finance, from digital finance to financial stability to regulatory issues to climate-related issues. And of course, in climate-related issues and environmental issues, it's easier because we did have a very good starting point. Was the International Platform of Sustainable Finance. Dr. Mayun here was one of the promoters of that idea, with this forward-looking view of the fact that there would be, as we have been seeing in many other areas, a probable proliferation of taxonomies, and we needed to have something that could make them comparable and usable in the different jurisdictions. This is why we created the Common Ground Taxonomy together with China, the first between the EU and China, which has some practical applications. You will see there are loans and bonds based on the Common Ground Taxonomy. It's good, it's a comparison. Of course, it's the starting point. And also in the context of the International Platform of Sustainable Finance, we will be working on extending the Common Ground Taxonomy to other sectors and areas where it has not been completed. So this is one of the parts that needs to be done. And also and also importantly, to incorporate more countries to the common ground taxonomy, so that again we understand that there are a lot of national specificities. We are very conscious of that, but at the end we really need to have a framework for making them compatible or comparable or interoperable. They will never be the same. I mean, we will, at least for the time being, because we are at the starting point, but at least that they can be used by everybody as a way to compare. Well, I'm doing this investment in Europe in this, I don't know, energy efficient project, and this investment in China or in Singapore in this energy efficient project, are they the same energy efficient? Or when I am talking about energy efficiency in China or in Europe, is a completely different issue. So these are the things that from a practical point of view are important, and of course we are committed to continue advancing on them together with China, which has been a very important collaborator with us on this issue. Thank you.
Great, thank you so much, Sabino. I guess we have to wrap up here. Let me sort of summarize with 30 seconds. Two key takeaways. One is interoperability. As we can see, the major regulatory issues, including taxonomy disclosure, they're going into the direction of too many inconsistent, incompatible sets of standards, principles, regulations, and so on, which may increase market segmentation, increase transaction cost, and probably causing some risk of greenwashing. That's why consolidation of these approaches into some common denominator for taxonomy, for disclosure, I think is hugely important. And in that area, I think Hong Kong can play a key role, because you are the testing ground for interoperable standards for both taxonomy and for disclosure. And you can demonstrate to the rest of the world how interoperability can actually work. The second thing is about capacity. Everything requires capacity building, right? In terms of adoption of taxonomy, adoption of ISSB on each of the key set elements. And this is a work not just for ISSB or the authority, but private sector. Everybody needs to do something. I think a lot of IT companies should jump out and do your simple tools and making sure ISSB disclosure cost will go down by 99%. That's my hope, that you can contribute massively to the feasibility of a global approach towards sustainable finance. Thank you very much. Thank you all for the panelists and your participation.
Thank you.